We do want to get to the latest, though, on the Israel-Hamas war, and for that, we're joined by our friend Dr. Alon Burstein, a UCI visiting assistant professor and Israel Institute fellow. As always, Alon, we appreciate having you here. We want to get straight to the news of the day, though. Per the Times of Israel, Qatar's foreign ministry announced that Hamas has given its initial positive confirmation to a proposed deal that would see hostages freed and fighting in Gaza stop for a period of time. The Times says that Israel has agreed to the proposal, confirming reports that Jerusalem okayed the deal at negotiations in Paris this weekend. At this point, what do we know about how this potential deal could work, Alon?
Because Qatar did put this out initially, then Hamas actually stated that's not true. Specifically, Osama Hamdan, Hamas representative in Lebanon, stated that's not true. Then the group itself also said that's not true. And then Qatar actually changed its update on its website, changing the wording, saying Hamas positively reacted to receiving the proposal and is debating it. So they've scaled back a little bit, saying that Hamas is positive about this, because what I think Qatar is trying to do is actually pressure Hamas into accepting. So they're trying to say things are already moving forward. Celebrations broke out in Gaza. As they heard about this, I think that Qatar is actually using this to try to pressure Hamas into this, but the sides are not there yet. The Hamas is debating the deal right now. What is happening is there's two different leaderships to Hamas. There's Ismail Haniyeh, who's the official leader of the group, and he resides actually in Qatar, and he's what's called the external leadership. And then there's Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But since the war broke out, he's really the leader. He's the one who decided on October 7th. Ismail Haniyeh didn't even know it was coming. And so Ismail Haniyeh, theoretically, is the one that would have to agree or disagree to this deal. But the fact is, he actually has no presence on the ground to say stop the fighting, release hostages or not. So the two sides are talking to one another and trying to see, can they agree on what they're going to demand? And then they'll go back to Qatar. So we're likely going to see their answer only in the coming days. What we know about the deal so far is that it's going to include several phases. The first phase is reportedly, according to different leaks, going to be between 35 days to possibly 45 days, and it is going to be a truce, in which time 35 to 40 hostages will be released. That includes women, children, and elderly and people who are sick. Israel will in turn release a certain amount of Palestinian prisoners, but reportedly not the heavy prisoners, rather, again, like 3 to 5 prisoners for each of these hostages. The main sticking point is the second phase of the deal, in which Israel wants already soldiers released, either female soldiers or possibly male soldiers even. And Hamas, as reportedly in return for releasing them, demanding several things that is going to be almost impossible for Israel to agree to. That includes releasing 100 to 250 Palestinian prisoners per each soldier, i.e. ultimately several thousand Palestinian prisoners. Israel agreeing to completely withdraw from the Gaza Strip and a complete end to the war. Those things are things that Israel said are not going to happen. What seemingly is the strategy is all the sides want a truce to start in order to hopefully build upon that, and then maybe convince Israel, you know what, you can't restart the war after 6 weeks, so therefore maybe you'll agree to the ceasefire. That is at least what reportedly the United States wants to happen. They want to just do the first phase, then we'll see. It remains to be seen if Hamas is going to agree to that. Hamas has said they're not going to agree to anything unless they already have guarantees that the end of it is an end to the war. Israel has said absolutely not going to agree to that. So it remains to be seen.
So, the next thing we want to get to, and I think we do have another tweet to pull up on this one as well, Reuters reporting that Israel prepared to advance its war on Gaza farther south to areas like Rafah, close to the Egyptian border, after claiming to have dismantled Hamas in Younis. I want to get to Rafah in a second, but first, the news that Hamas has been dismantled in Younis sounds like a big deal, given it was somewhat of a hub for Hamas. What does this tell us about the progress that Israel is making in Gaza?
So again, I'll say that that's a bit of an overstatement. That statement was made by Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant today. He visited Khan Younis, and Israeli Minister of Defense, and he stated to the soldiers, "You have dismantled Hamas in Khan Younis." That is not true according to what's on the ground. On the ground, there's daily, very, very intensive battles, specifically in western Khan Younis. And reportedly, the IDF has not even engaged Hamas's southern Khan Younis brigade. Khan Younis was, in fact, one of the strongest hubs of Hamas, had 4 different brigades there. The IDF reportedly has already managed to annihilate the Eastern Brigade, the Northern Brigade, and possibly is now engaging the Western Brigade. However, it still remains to be seen what happens with the Southern Brigade. In addition to that, there's also still the underground network. The IDF has been engaging with it. It has not dismantled it yet. I think what the Minister of Defense was more trying to indicate with this is, look, Khan Younis is a done deal. If it happens now, or if it happens in a week from now, Khan Younis, as far as we're concerned, we know the IDF is going to quote unquote win there. It's dismantled 3 out of the 4 brigades. It'll manage to dismantle the 4th without a lot of losses. And therefore, he was saying, so therefore the sights can already be set on the next goal, the next city, which is Rafah. So I would say it hasn't finished the work in Khan Younis in terms of fighting Hamas. That's going on constantly. The IDF assessments are that actually a lot of the hostages are still held in underground tunnels underneath Khan Younis. So it's a far cry to say the IDF is done in Khan Younis. But I think what they're trying to say is that the IDF has managed to achieve as much control in Khan Younis as necessary to say, look, it may take another week, right? But effectively, this is going to be done. Whether it's another week, another 2 weeks, it's not where it was 2-3 weeks ago where, oh my God, they're entering Khan Younis, what's going to happen? It's pretty clear that we know what's going to happen. They're going to win there. It may just take another week or two. I think that's more how I would read that statement.
So the next thing we want to get to, and you're looking at a picture from the Times of Gaza right now, I do want to talk about Rafah. A lot of people have fled south to this region as the war has progressed. My understanding is that a lot of humanitarian aid has also come through the Rafah crossing as well over time. What challenges are Palestinians and the Israeli military both facing as this war appears to focus more on this region?
It is going to be a culmination of some of the most disastrous things that we've seen in the war if the fighting does in fact go there. In Rafah, we have right now upwards of 1.5 million people in a city that used to house 300,000 people. The vast majority of the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip has fled to Rafah and what's called the Muasi area, which is on the coastal line. They are all housed in makeshift refugee camps. The area is completely overcrowded. We are seeing in their humanitarian disasters in terms of their reports of maternity hospitals at 300% capacity, women giving birth without anesthesia. We also had reports today of a black market industry that is starting to develop in the refugee camps with regards to, for example, tents that are being sold at the price of what used to be a small apartment in the Gaza Strip. Also, a lack of access to basic goods, spreading of hepatitis A. The situation in the refugee camps in and around Rafah is absolutely atrocious. With that, the idea that the IDF is just going to invade it in the same way as it invaded the northern parts of the Gaza Strip or Khan Younis is not realistic. Invading the areas, there's no room, I'm now talking literally, no room for a tank to go through the streets there because there's tents in the middle of the street. So some reports suggested that the IDF may try to do now a reverse evacuation. The people who have become internally displaced and moved to Rafah now pull them back to Khan Younis or to other areas in the central parts of the Gaza Strip in order to allow the IDF to go in. That may be possible. It seems unrealistic. At the same time, if you'd asked me, 4 months ago, can the IDF evacuate 1 million people from the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, I would have said that's completely unrealistic, and it happened. So maybe that will happen as part of the fighting. However, even if that does happen, that's a major challenge. And if that doesn't happen, the IDF is simply not going to be able to invade in this same way. It's not going to be able to carry out the same bombings that it carried out. The bombings paved the way for IDF soldiers to come in and fight with a lot more safety. It's not going to be able to carry out these bombings when there are so many different refugees spread throughout the area. In addition to that, there's one more major problem, and that is Egypt. The Rafah city is actually divided between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. That's where the Rafah crossing is. Israel's peace treaty with Egypt states that neither side can have more than X amount of troops on the border as part of the peace treaty. And Egypt has said it is going to hold Israel to that. They've said that for several reasons, mostly because they're fearful of a major ground invasion of Israel that will result in Palestinians fleeing across the border. So they are trying to stop Israel from coming into that. But that would compromise Israel's relationship with Egypt, and that is something Israel cannot afford to do. So that's a diplomatic crisis, in addition to the humanitarian crisis, in addition to the hardship that Israel would have in invading. Again, I've come to expect the unexpected in this war. I would not have thought that this amount of civilians would be able to evacuate from the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, so maybe it will be possible to re-evacuate civilians. But right now, it seems that at least a lot more planning is going to have to happen, and certainly if we do see this truce and this hostage deal, it's very unlikely to happen before that, right? Because that's something that's going to take weeks to actually implement. And the hostage deal is theoretically being brewed now for the the coming weeks. So I can't see Israel starting a major operation if it wants the hostage deal to succeed in Rafah before either the negotiations come to fruition or fail. I think one or the other.
Yeah, we're looking, let's pull up this clip because we have some video posted by the Israeli Air Force showing a fighter jet attacking military structures in southern Lebanon where low-intensity fighting continues between Hezbollah and Israel. The AP today put out a report saying the prospect of a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah terrifies people on both sides of the border, but some see it as inevitable. Do you get that same feeling, Doctor, that it'll be tough to avoid further escalations between the two parties?
At this point, the problem is not the fighting between the parties. The problem is how do the parties come back to saying we can live with the status quo? Because what happened on October 7th shook Israeli society so much. The idea that terror organizations can just break through the IDF ranks, storm Israeli towns and kidnap civilians and kidnap soldiers. Hezbollah is stronger than Hamas, and by any measure. And so if Hamas could do that, Hezbollah's presence on the border is extremely scary to Israelis, and thus reports between 80,000 and 200,000, but more likely closer to 80,000 civilians, Israeli civilians, have evacuated from the northern parts of Israel. For them to return to the north, Israel has said, we will no longer allow Hezbollah to be on the border. So theoretically, if the war in Gaza ends, both sides could stop their fire and that's it. But that's actually not good enough at this point. And that's why escalations almost seem inevitable. Because even if both sides just stop their fire and go back to how it was on October 6th, in Israel, there's an inability to live with Hezbollah, what's called the Radwan force, that's their main commando units, sitting on the border, able to carry out an October 7th attack similar to what Hamas carried out. So very likely we're going to have to see something that breaks the status quo. It seemed a couple of weeks ago that that may be some sort of diplomatic solution because neither Israel nor Hezbollah have an interest in a war right now. So maybe Hezbollah would agree to move north a certain amount of miles, and that would be enough to satisfy Israel, and that would be a diplomatic solution. Right now, it seems further. It seems that both sides have moved away from that, each for their own internal political reasons. In Israel, Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure from his coalition to keep the war going, so he's also backed away from that a little. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is under a lot of pressure from Iran to keep the war escalating, and therefore they've also backed away from that a little. So it does seem, on the one hand, like it's somewhat inevitable. On the other hand, it's important to remember neither side really wants it. So both sides may look for a way to climb down from their tree. That's what the U.S. Special Envoy to the region, Alon Burstein, is returning to Israel next week. Theoretically, he's trying to just find the formula to make both sides say, you know what, I can live with that. See, I pushed Hezbollah back enough. Or Hezbollah saying, see, I did not do everything Israel wanted. I only moved back 2 miles or something like that to let both sides say, you can climb down, because neither side really has an interest. But it remains to be seen because at the same point, both sides are really locked in this low intensity back and forth right now. A report came out in Israel today saying that Israel has a dilemma if, in fact, the truce with Hamas comes into effect. In November, when the truce came into effect, Hezbollah stopped firing. Hezbollah said, we fire as long as the war is going on. Right now, there's a truce. And Israel also stopped firing because Israel said, okay, we're just returning fire for fire. But right now, like I said, Israel's saying, no, we actually need, it's not enough for us to say there's no fire. We need Hezbollah to move back. So is Israel going to stop the fire with Hezbollah for 6 weeks? If there's a truce, Israel's saying maybe not. Remains to be seen.
Last thing I want to hit before we go here, the United States has approved plans for a multi-day strike in Iraq and Syria against multiple targets, including Iranian personnel and facilities. That was a CBS News report today that said that, citing U.S. officials. This comes after that attack in Jordan that killed 3 American soldiers. Nothing has happened yet, Alon, so we're just working off of this report here. But if this is in line with what the U.S. eventually does, what type of potential targets are in Iraq and Syria?
There are lots of Iranian targets in both of those countries. Iran has so many interests in Iraq and Syria in terms of its militias, in terms of diplomats, in terms of banking, in terms of simply training facilities for its different militias. So there is a plethora of targets. It's very interesting to see what is happening with this situation with Iran, because Iran seemingly, for all of its rhetoric, seemingly is very actually scared of a regional escalation right now. Iran is the one who likely ordered the Hezbollah and Iraq brigades to make a public announcement that they're no longer going to attack the United States. That is the militia that carried out the attack on Tower 22. they've said where they're no longer going to carry that out. That was Iran's orders. Iran also reportedly pulled all of its Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers and also second-rate officers out of Syria in the last 24 hours because they were fearful of Israeli attacks that would drag Iran into a war. Iran wants this low-level regional escalation, but like Hezbollah, doesn't actually want to engage in this all-out war. So what we're probably going to see is the United States attacking Iran-affiliated targets, not necessarily Iranian targets themselves, because the United States does not want to enter into a war with Iran either. But instead, we're going to see affiliated targets. This could be anything from, let's say, Iranian government interests in oil development, that there's a plethora of such targets in Iraq. So it's not going to be an attack against Iran, but maybe an Iranian-owned factory that's owned by the government. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards owns tons of different economic manufacturing plants and all kinds of things like that in Iraq and in Syria. Maybe attacks against those. So we'll see attacks against things that are very symbolic probably for Iran or their militias, but not necessarily like an attack against an Iranian military unit that will then create an all-out war. We're going to see an escalation, but still of this proxy war and things like that, is my estimate at least.
We'll be waiting to see how the U.S. handles this situation. Dr. Alon Burstein, a UCI visiting assistant professor and Israel Institute fellow, also regularly posting on YouTube his own daily updates. We always appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good night.